Flagstaff, Arizona, a city framed by pine-covered mountains, quiet streets, and a sense of distance from everything. Claire Miller had long stopped expecting peace. Ever since the disappearance of her husband, life had been nothing but survival. She was now a night shift nurse at Northern Arizona Medical Center, juggling exhaustion and motherhood. Her son, Ethan, had been the silent center of her world. Silent not metaphorically, literally. Ethan Miller, 8 years old, didn't speak to anyone but his mother. Not at school, not to neighbors, not even a word to other kids. After a childhood trauma no one could quite define, doctors called it selective mutism. But Claire knew it wasn't just that. Something inside. Her son worked differently. Something buried. He communicated with drawings, pages and pages of detailed, almost obsessive sketches, most of them of aircrafts, fighter jets, commercial planes, blueprints, cockpit layouts, and emergency landing protocols. Claire tried not to worry. He was just fascinated, she thought. Maybe too fascinated. That morning, Claire stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were tired, but for once, she was smiling. Her boss had given her and Ethan 2 round-trip tickets to Seattle. Make a memory, he'd said. It was a gift. After months of loss, hardship, and silence, it felt like a miracle. Ready? She asked, gently. Ethan was sitting on the floor of their tiny living room, drawing with a sharpened pencil, tongue between his lips in concentration. He looked up. No words, but he nodded. Hours later, they boarded flight AZ-1840, a sleek Airbus A321, bound for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Claire guided Ethan through the aisle, apologizing when his sketchpad brushed against passengers. He didn't look up. His eyes were locked on something else, the open cockpit door. Inside, 2 pilots were chatting with the head flight attendant. Ethan's gaze scanned everything. The sequence of the checklist, the way the captain tapped the keypad to close the security panel, the flashing green on the autopilot system. He blinked slowly, memorizing. They took their seats in row, 14 just behind the wing. Claire buckled his belt for him. You okay? She whispered. Ethan looked out the window, then nodded slowly. Takeoff was smooth. Claire, finally relaxing, leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She didn't see Ethan tilt his head to watch the flight attendants prepare the drinks cart. She didn't see his focus narrow as 2 small trays were handed through the cockpit door, one labeled P1 and the other P2. She didn't see him blink when, 15 minutes later, one of the attendants knocked again on the cockpit door and got no answer. But Ethan saw everything, and he remembered every single detail. The soft hum of the engines grew steadily as the Airbus A321 climbed into the clear Arizona sky, leaving behind the pine-crowned ridges of Flagstaff. For most passengers, it was just another routine flight on a mild spring morning. For Claire, it was a rare breath of calm, something almost foreign since her husband's death. She let her body relax against the seat, one hand resting on Ethan's small shoulder. Her son, nestled against the window, didn't flinch. His eyes were wide, fixed on the shifting layers of clouds outside, but Claire knew his mind was somewhere else entirely. Ethan wasn't afraid of flying. He wasn't much afraid of anything, not in the way most children were. He was quiet, focused, and unusually self-contained. The sketchpad on his lap was already open, and on the current page, the faint outlines of a cockpit began to take shape, precise, deliberate lines etched in pencil, mimicking every panel, button, and switch he had glimpsed before takeoff. What others dismissed as childhood curiosity, Ethan treated as study. Observation was his first language. As the plane leveled out above 30,000 feet, the cabin settled into a lull. Flight attendants rolled out the beverage carts, offering smiles and choices to rows of dozing or distracted passengers. Claire, overcome by exhaustion and comforted by the subtle rocking of the aircraft, leaned her head to one side and slowly drifted into sleep. Her breathing became deep and even, her hand slipping gently from Ethan's arm. Ethan remained still. His eyes, however, followed every motion with calculated attention. He watched as two of the attendants exchanged glances before one of them knocked softly on the cockpit door. The tray she carried had 2 drinks, each with a thin slice of lemon and a sealed lid. The door opened a sliver, just enough for the tray to slide inside. The flight attendant nodded politely, then moved on, a routine gesture, unnoticed by nearly everyone, except Ethan. Minutes passed. Then something shifted. From row 2, a tall, middle-aged man stood up suddenly and walked to the front. He paused, confused, then bent toward the curtain separating first class from the galley. He seemed to speak briefly with one of the crew, who tensed visibly. She gave a tight smile and disappeared behind the curtain again. Ethan saw her knock once more on the cockpit door. No response. A ripple of unease passed between the attendants. One of them hurried down the aisle, quietly asking if there was a doctor or medical professional on board. A hand rose near. The back, an older man, gray-haired, with a stethoscope looped around his neck as if by instinct. He stepped forward. The crew unlocked the small emergency panel and handed him a code to punch into the cockpit's keypad. Still nothing. The door remained locked from the inside. The doctor looked through the small external viewing panel into the cockpit, then turned back to the attendants with a grave expression. He murmured something about fixed pupils and unresponsiveness. Ethan, still silent, had already pieced it together. He had noticed the exact moment both pilots had stopped adjusting controls, their bodies slumped forward, hands limp, motionless. But no one noticed the boy in row 14. No one suspected the quiet child had been memorizing the entire sequence of the cockpit locking system since boarding. No one imagined that inside his head, a map of every button, every emergency override, every standard protocol had already been drawn, revised, and rehearsed. The chaos was just beginning. As tension escalated in the front cabin, a sense of collective helplessness began to take root. Passengers near the cockpit whispered anxiously, straining to make sense of the crew's increasingly pale faces. The locked door had become a symbol of panic, a barrier between hope and catastrophe. The flight attendants exchanged clipped words with the doctor and with each other, their attempts at calm professionalism starting to unravel. Somewhere between the uncertainty and the rising dread, a quiet voice might have soothed them, but Ethan Miller remained silent. From his seat in, Ethan absorbed the chaos like a sponge. The shouted questions, the failed radio calls, the trembling hands, it all moved around him like background noise. His eyes were fixed ahead, the way one studies a familiar puzzle. When the lead attendant tried the emergency override panel, a second time with no result, the reality of the situation became brutally clear. The pilots were unconscious, the door was sealed from the inside, and no one on board knew how to bypass the lock. Ethan stood slowly, unnoticed at first. His mother still slept, undisturbed by the storm gathering around her. The sketchpad slipped onto the seat as he stepped into the aisle, small and barefoot, his fingers brushing the seats as he moved forward. He reached the cockpit door without a word, his face expressionless. The crew barely noticed him until he paused directly before the keypad. Then one of them reached instinctively to pull him back. But she hesitated. Something in his posture stopped her. Deliberately, Ethan raised his hand and entered the code, one digit, then another, and another. His movements were precise, assured, as if he'd done this 100 times before. The keypad emitted a soft beep, then a louder click. The door opened. A gasp swept through the nearby rows. Behind the thick barrier, both pilots were slumped in their seats. The captain's face was ashen, his mouth slightly open. The co-pilot's head leaned to the side, twitching faintly but with no sign of consciousness. The cockpit itself was a symphony of alerts, soft chimes, blinking warnings, and automated voice prompts repeating in measured tones. No one moved, not the crew, not the doctor, not even the passengers watching in stunned silence. Except Ethan. He stepped over the threshold, the door swinging open behind him. No one stopped him. Not even the woman who had tried to pull him back. Perhaps they were too stunned. Or perhaps, on some primal level, they sensed something unusual in the boy's calm. Ethan climbed into the right-hand seat, the co-pilot's chair, and adjusted it with the familiarity of someone who had practiced it over and over in his imagination. His hands hovered over the controls, reading the situation with unnerving clarity. The artificial horizon, the autopilot status, the altitude warnings, all of it absorbed in seconds. He didn't need to speak. His fingers spoke for him. Near the galley, a man in his late 50s watched carefully. His name was Ronald Green, a former air traffic controller with 30 years of experience, now retired. He leaned into the aisle, squinting toward the cockpit. What he saw sent a chill through him, not panic, not recklessness, but discipline. Whoever that boy was, Ronald could tell by the sequence of buttons he pressed and the steady adjustments to the throttle that he wasn't acting at random. This was muscle memory. It was training, or something like it. He turned toward the crew and said with conviction, "He knows what he's doing." And suddenly, for the first time since the chaos began, someone on board believed in the boy who never spoke. Inside the cockpit, time felt different. The world outside the windshield stretched endlessly, a canvas of layered clouds beneath, the fuselage and an indifferent blue above. The alarms had subsided into a rhythm of low alerts, steady beeps and blinking icons that Ethan interpreted with uncanny calm. His hands moved across the panels with the grace of someone syncing instinct with memory. Each action was purposeful. He wasn't improvising. He was remembering. A headset hung loosely from the co-pilot's seat. Ethan slipped it over his ears, adjusting it clumsily but efficiently. The microphone dangled near his cheek, and for a long moment he stared at it, his mouth shut. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His attention turned to the transponder panel, and with swift fingers, he tapped in an emergency code, 7700, the universal signal for distress. In the control tower hundreds of miles away, radars would light up instantly, and the AZ-1840's status would shift from routine to critical. Down in the Seattle tower, a controller named Lara Jensen was the first to spot the code change. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned toward the monitor. An aircraft squawking 7700 without prior radio contact was not common, and the system flagged it as urgent. She immediately alerted the supervisor, and within seconds, the control room shifted gears. Phones rang, screens refocused, protocols kicked in. Something was wrong on flight AZ-1840 and no one knew what yet. Back in the cockpit, Ethan began pressing combinations on the radio interface. He didn't speak into the mic. He couldn't. But he had watched enough cockpit recordings to understand how radio systems responded to inputs. On the tower's side, Lara heard faint signals, background static, and then something odd. A rhythmic flicker of transmission noise, almost like tapping. She frowned, thinking at first it was a malfunction. But then she heard it again. Short bursts, spaced evenly, a pattern. At her console, Lara opened a direct channel to the aircraft. AZ-1840, this is Seattle Center. We've received your distress code. Please confirm the nature of your emergency. Silence. Then, in response, a sequence of short beeps filtered through the channel. 5 tones. Pause. 3. Pause. 1. It repeated. She wrote it down instinctively, confused, until a technician beside her leaned over with widening eyes. That's Morse code. The message was simple, chilling, and surreal. Pilots down. The room froze. Lara reached for the override mic. AZ-1840, this is Seattle Center. Who is flying the aircraft? There was no verbal response, only another sequence. 3 slow beeps, pause, then 2. Again, she turned to the technician. It's a child, he whispered. He's saying I am 8. On board? Claire stirred awake in her seat, disoriented. Around her, the atmosphere had changed. People whispered nervously, some craning their necks toward the front. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant was in tears. holding a phone, linked to the intercom. Claire blinked, sat up, and asked what was happening. The answer came not from words, but from a pointed, shaky finger toward the open cockpit. She stood. As she approached the front, the view that awaited her drained every ounce of breath from her lungs. Her son, her silent, gentle, strange little boy, was seated at the controls of a commercial aircraft, his hands steady, his face calm, headset on, lights blinking around him. The scene was too surreal, too impossible. She staggered forward, caught by one of the attendants. "Ma'am, please," the woman started, but Claire didn't listen. She stepped inside the cockpit, and when Ethan turned his head slightly and looked her in the eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Conviction. He wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply doing what had to be done. And in that moment, Claire realized something that shattered her heart and rebuilt it all at once. She had never truly known what her son was capable of. The aircraft drifted through the sky at 34,000 feet, an invisible crisis unfolding in a sealed world of metal and silence. In the cockpit, Claire remained frozen beside her son, her breathing shallow, her hands slightly trembling. She had witnessed medical emergencies, trauma, even death, but nothing compared to the stillness now surrounding them. Ethan sat firm in the co-pilot's chair, one hand on the yoke, the other flicking switches with surgical precision. He didn't flinch under her gaze. His expression remained unreadable, but beneath it, she could see it now. An intense focus she had mistaken for years as detachment. Behind them, the cabin had transformed. A priest whispered prayers near the galley. A woman sobbed quietly into her scarf. And the former controller, Ronald Green, tried to explain, again, to the crew that the boy had done everything right so far. Still, disbelief gripped everyone. "A child," they kept repeating. "A child is flying this plane." And yet, the plane remained steady in the sky. In Seattle's control tower, the realization had fully settled. The Airbus was under the command of an unidentified juvenile tower, communicating through primitive signals. Lara Jensen took the lead on the channel, speaking slowly, clearly, hoping Ethan could keep following. She gave him updated wind patterns, air traffic, conditions on descent schedules, each broken down to basics. The boy responded not with words, but with alternating beeps and control inputs that aligned perfectly with her instructions. Technically, it shouldn't have been possible, but the aircraft was still aloft, and no further errors had occurred. Back in the cockpit, Claire sat down slowly in the pilot's seat beside her son. She didn't touch anything. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at him and whispered softly, "I'm here, Ethan." He didn't respond, but something in his posture softened. She didn't need more than that. The plane banked, slightly left aboard, a smooth adjustment to a vector heading transmitted by the tower. As Claire observed her son, memories began to resurface, fragments she had buried over time. The drawings, the endless nights watching videos of aircraft landings, the toy joystick he wouldn't let go of. But there was something else, something buried deeper. She remembered the envelope, the one she never had the strength to open. It had been left to her the week after her husband disappeared. Mark Miller, once a test pilot for military prototypes, had vanished during a classified operation. His belongings were sent home, including a sealed letter addressed simply to "My son." Claire had stored it in a box, untouched, unable to bear the weight of what it might say. She thought it would crush Ethan with grief. But now, she realized it might contain something else entirely. She stood abruptly and returned to their seats. With shaking hands, she pulled Ethan's backpack from under the chair and opened the front pocket. There, folded with a reverence that broke her heart, was the letter. Claire's breath hitched as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Mark's, sharp, clean, disciplined. She read it slowly, her eyes welling up as the truth unraveled line by line. If you're reading this, Bang Sun, then I'm probably not coming back. But I need you to know something. I don't know what part of me you carry, but if you ever feel drawn to the sky, if the sound of engines calms you, if you feel like you can understand a machine better than people, that's me in you, and I want you to trust it. Trust yourself. One day it might matter more than anything else. One day instinct may be the only thing between you and something impossible, and I believe in you, even if I never got to say it out loud. Claire's tears fell freely now. She looked up and saw that Ethan was watching her, not panicked, not confused, just waiting. She handed him the letter. He didn't open, and he didn't need to. He simply placed one hand over hers, squeezing it gently. It was the only confirmation she needed. He already knew. Outside the windshield, the sky began to change. The sun tilted westward, casting a golden line over the horizon. The tower's voice returned, firm but cautious. AZ 1840. Prepare to begin initial descent. Ethan's fingers moved over the controls without hesitation. Claire looked at her son one last time before placing her hand over his on the yoke, and whispered, not out of fear, but reverence. You're not alone. Not anymore. The descent began with a whisper of mechanical tension, flaps adjusting, altitude slowly decreasing, the aircraft subtly shifting as the autopilot disengaged. In the cockpit, the atmosphere grew denser, not because of the cabin pressure, but from the emotional weight of what was unfolding. Ethan's small hands moved confidently over the controls, his shoulders squared, his gaze unwavering. Outside, the golden sunlight had faded into a heavy overcast, clouds gathering. Over the Pacific Northwest like a shroud, Seattle awaited below, but so did uncertainty. Claire remained beside her son, eyes fixed on his profile. The hum of the cockpit instruments surrounded them, creating a strange kind of serenity amidst the storm of thoughts flooding her mind. The realization that her child, this quiet, gentle boy who had never raised his voice nor declared his dreams aloud, was now guiding a commercial airliner filled with over 100 souls down from cruising altitude, was something no mother could prepare for. And yet, watching him, she felt no fear. His silence had always hidden something deep, and now she knew it had hidden strength. In the rear of the plane, the mood shifted. People had stopped asking questions. Panic gave way to a fragile, hushed awe. The former air traffic controller, Ronald Yauer, explained in a low voice that the child seemed to be following protocol. He was receiving headings from the tower, adjusting pitch and speed correctly, even responding in real time to altimeter changes. A quiet reverence spread, like in a church. No one clapped. No one dared speak loudly. It was as though everyone instinctively understood that any break in the quiet might snap the thin thread holding them all together. On the ground, emergency teams mobilized with military precision. Seattle-Tacoma International cleared its longest runway, diverted inbound flights, and prepped crash teams. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the perimeter, their lights flashing, in silent urgency. Inside the tower, Lara Jensen held the radio channel open, repeating clear, gentle instructions. You're doing great. Just a few more vectors. Maintain heading, reduce to 180 knots. Her voice was steady, but her heart was racing. She had never guided a child through descent. No one had. There was no manual for this. Ethan responded not with words, but with actions. Each instruction from Lara was followed with a precise adjustment. His breathing remained even. He glanced at the artificial horizon, confirmed the ILS instrument landing system lock, and trimmed the aircraft with a movement so smooth it unnerved the professionals monitoring the telemetry. At one point, he blinked twice, a subtle gesture Claire recognized, something he did whenever he was fully immersed, entering a space where nothing existed except the task before him. She didn't interrupt. She simply placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, anchoring him without disturbing his concentration. The descent passed through the first thick layer of clouds, and the turbulence intensified. The plane trembled slightly, Enough for murmurs to ripple through the cabin. Claire tightened her grip on the seat, watching Ethan make small-eyed confident corrections to the yoke. There was no panic in his eyes, only calculation, no hesitation, only instinct. For every moment that passed, Claire's fear of the sky was replaced by awe. Her son, the boy no one understood, the child who couldn't speak in public, was navigating a machine built by adults, programmed for professionals. Through a situation that should have broken him, Lara's voice returned through the headset. "Runway in sight in 3 minutes. You're lined up perfectly. Just keep her steady." On the ground, reporters were already arriving. A crowd had formed behind the security barriers, unaware of who was in control, only that a potential miracle was unfolding in the clouds above. Ethan glanced at Claire for just a second. A silent confirmation passed between them. He turned back to the approach. Outside the cockpit windows, the runway lights began to flicker into view, glowing through the haze like the outline of salvation. Claire whispered, not to guide him, not to instruct him, but simply because she had to say it. "Whatever happens, I believe in you." And still, Ethan said nothing. He only flew. As the aircraft pierced through the final wall of cloud, the world below finally revealed itself. Runway lights stretched in perfect alignment, glistening in the moisture-heavy dusk like a path drawn just for them. Ethan's eyes didn't widen, his breathing didn't change. There was a stillness in him that defied the chaos around. The only movement was the gentle precision with which he adjusted the flaps and lowered the landing gear. The thunk of the wheels locking into place sent a tremor through the fuselage and down the spines of every passenger. The silence was so thick, it seemed even the engines dared not interrupt. Claire sat frozen in the pilot's chair, her heart pulsing in rhythms far more erratic than the aircraft's controlled descent. She could see the faint blur of flashing red and blue lights lining the edges of the runway, the fire trucks parked at calculated intervals, the silhouettes of emergency personnel bracing for impact. There were too many variables: wind shear, weight imbalance, and wet ground, the unpredictability of a machine that had already been abandoned by its trained pilots. But Ethan didn't blink. His hands remained firm on the yoke, his left thumb adjusting the thrust levers slowly, calibrating airspeed with the kind of grace that seemed born rather than taught. In the cabin, tension mounted to a boiling point. Some passengers squeezed, hands in silence. Others pressed their foreheads against the seats in front of them. One man recorded a final voice message to his wife, his words cracking under the strain, and yet there was no screaming. Somehow, the serenity in the cockpit had spread. Ronald Green stood quietly by the flight deck door, watching the descent on the overhead display, tears blurring his vision. "He's not just landing this plane," he murmured to no one. "He's carrying every one of us." The aircraft was now less than 200 feet above the runway. Wind buffeted the nose slightly, causing a minor yaw. Ethan compensated, instantly, nudging the rudder pedals with his feet, his face still expressionless but aware. Claire noticed a flicker in the altimeter needle, a drop faster than expected. Her instinct as a mother screamed to reach for the controls. But she didn't move. She had promised herself she wouldn't. This was Ethan's flight, his silence, his reckoning. The plane crossed the runway threshold. At 100 feet, the call-outs began to echo through the cockpit. 50, 40, 30. The voice of the automated system was mechanical, devoid of emotion. And then, 10. Ethan pulled back gently on the yoke. The impact was sudden but controlled, a hard thud that rippled through the entire body of the plane, followed by a long, low groan of rubber against asphalt. The main gear touched first, then the nose dipped and met the earth with a judder. The cabin erupted into cries, not of fear, but of astonished disbelief. The sound of the spoilers deploying and reverse thrusters engaging drowned them out, for a moment as the aircraft decelerated with aching slowness. Outside the windows, emergency vehicles raced to match their path. Inside, no one moved. It wasn't over. Ethan's hands remained on the controls. Even as the plane slowed to a crawl, Claire saw it in his expression, the same restraint, He showed after finishing a drawing or solving a puzzle. No celebration, no victory, just purpose, not yet completed. The plane rolled for another 15 seconds, then finally, gently, came to a full stop near the far end of the runway. Only then did Ethan release the yoke. He leaned back in the seat for the first time in over an hour, his shoulders relaxing imperceptibly. Claire reached for him slowly, unsure whether to speak or simply hold him. But before she could decide, he turned his head toward her and, in a voice so small it seemed impossible, he whispered 3 words she hadn't heard in years. "It's okay now." She broke. The tears came not as a wave, but a collapse. She pulled him close, her forehead against his temple, and just held him there while the cabin behind them erupted. Cheers, sobs, applause rising like thunder through the steel walls. People embraced strangers. Some shouted praise, others prayed in gratitude. It didn't matter that no one understood how. What mattered was that they were alive, because of him, because a boy's hand didn't tremble. The emergency exits remained sealed for several minutes after the aircraft came to a stop. Outside, flashing lights pulsed against the wet tarmac, mirrored faintly in the plane's windows like a heartbeat echoing across steel. Inside the cockpit, the glow of the control panel began to dim, warning signals silenced, systems stabilizing. The chaos had dissolved into something quieter, heavier. When the cabin doors finally opened, a rush of cold air flooded in, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps and muffled radios. Emergency personnel entered swiftly, expecting trauma, confusion, perhaps even hysteria. But what they found was a plane full of people too stunned to speak. Ethan remained in his seat, headset still around his neck, gaze unfocused. Claire sat beside him, no longer trying to comprehend the impossible. She had given up searching for logic in what had just occurred and instead surrendered to something simpler, more profound: awe. A quiet, consuming awe at the realization that her son had not only saved their lives but had done so with a level of composure and mastery few adults could have summoned. The silence he carried for years now felt like something sacred. No longer a symptom of trauma, but a vessel of something vast. Medical teams rushed into the cockpit, bypassing Ethan at first in their rush to the 2 pilots. A pair of paramedics pulled the captain and co-pilot from their seats, checking vital signs, administering oxygen, examining pupils. The diagnosis came swiftly, spoken in hushed tones among professionals. It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't fatigue. It was poisoning, likely accidental, a food contamination issue. Tests would later confirm the presence of a rare bacterial toxin in the lemon wedges served with the drinks. No criminal intent, just an overlooked logistic in a rushed catering process on the mistake, devastating in its reach. The news spread fast. A boy with no training who hadn't spoken publicly in years had landed a commercial aircraft alone. Reporters flooded the terminal before the passengers even disembarked. Microphones awaited the first words from the boy hero. Cameras panned across every face descending the stairs onto the wet tarmac. But Ethan said nothing. He didn't wave, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the storm his silence had created. Claire shielded him with her body, one arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders, guiding him past the questions and flashes of light. They were taken to a nearby hospital for observation, alongside the rest of the passengers and crew. Ethan sat on the examination table, legs swinging slightly above the floor, while doctors murmured outside the curtain, trying to match clinical reports with the boy's impossible actions. Claire sat beside him, holding his sketch pad, which he had clutched the entire way there. She flipped through it slowly, page after page of mechanical systems, angle trajectories, runway layouts. There was nothing childlike in those drawings. They were blueprints of intention, a mind preparing for something long before it arrived. Among the items returned to Claire was the letter from Mark, now folded neatly into her back pocket. She showed it to one of the attending physicians, who in turn passed it to an aviation psychologist. Within hours, a quiet investigation began into the contents of the envelope. Experts reviewed the technical annotations Mark had left behind, notes about emergency landing procedures, cockpit checklists, control diagrams. But what left them speechless wasn't just the accuracy. It was the foresight. The man had written it for a child not yet old enough to read. It wasn't a training manual. It was a gift of trust, written by a father who must have known, somehow, that his son would need it. Claire watched as Ethan finally lay down in the hospital bed, the edges of exhaustion catching up to his small frame. She brushed his hair back gently, her heart still trying to find rhythm after the chaos. For the first time in months, maybe years, he looked truly at peace. And in the space between sleep and waking, he turned toward her and whispered one final phrase that night, soft as breath. "I remembered everything, Mom." She kissed his forehead and whispered back, "I know, my love. The whole world knows now." The days following the emergency landing unfolded with surreal intensity. News of the incident spread rapidly, transcending borders and time zones. Media outlets scrambled for footage, interviews, any angle that could explain how an 8-year-old boy diagnosed with selective mutism had commandeered an aircraft and guided it safely to the ground. Commentators debated, psychologists speculated, and flight analysts deconstructed every available detail. Yet, none of them could fully articulate the truth. What had happened aboard Flight 1840 had moved beyond the language of facts. It had become myth, an extraordinary tale written in silence. Claire refused every interview request. She declined television appearances, magazine profiles, and commercial offers, determined to protect Ethan from the crushing spotlight that now circled like a storm. The hospital discharged them after 3 nights, declaring Ethan physically unharmed. But what no one could assess was the internal landscape of a boy who had lived for years in stillness and, in one extraordinary hour, shattered the silence not with words, but with action. At home in Flagstaff, the front door had barely closed behind them before the first letter arrived. It was from the Seattle Aviation Academy. The envelope was thick, the paper textured, the seal embossed in silver. Claire read the letter 3 times before saying anything. It was not just a polite acknowledgement, it was an invitation, personal and reverent in tone. The Academy's director expressed not only admiration, but genuine curiosity. They wished to meet the boy, not for spectacle or publicity, but to understand him. There were no strings, no expectations, only an offer to visit their facilities, see the simulators, meet real pilots and engineers. "Your son," the letter said, "demonstrates a rare cognitive profile. If he's willing, we would be honored to show him the sky from our side." At first, Claire hesitated. She watched Ethan's face as he read the letter silently, scanning each word with the same intensity he brought to every technical drawing. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He merely nodded once and set the letter down. That was all she needed. They packed lightly and returned to Seattle 2 weeks later, not as survivors, but as guests. The Academy welcomed them with restrained warmth, avoiding theatrics. Ethan was led through long corridors filled with models, archives, and motion-based simulators that mimicked cockpit conditions in stunning detail. He didn't rush. He absorbed everything slowly, like the pages of a manual. The instructors noticed quickly what others had overlooked. Ethan didn't just understand systems. He visualized them. In one simulation, they set him in front of a simplified interface and watched as he instinctively adjusted pitch and throttle, managing altitude within a margin of error even seasoned trainees struggled to achieve. No one spoke as he worked. There was something sacred in the observation. Later, the head instructor, a stoic woman named Captain Reyes, pulled Claire aside. Her voice was low, edged with disbelief. "He's not just bright," she said. "He's precise. He sees patterns in real time. It's not talent, it's design. You may have given birth to one of the most innately gifted spatial minds I've ever seen." Claire didn't know how to respond. For years, she had feared her son's silence meant fragility. Now, she understood it was the opposite. His quiet was not weakness. It was focus, density, a form of intelligence that didn't crave expression. It only needed room to breathe. In the weeks that followed, Claire made a decision. They would move. Flagstaff had been a home born of survival, Seattle. She hoped theirs could be a place for beginning. With help from the academy and the support of the community that had quietly rallied behind Ethan's story, she found a small house near Lake Union. Ethan enrolled in a specialized educational program, small, groups, i.e. open-ended modules, instructors who saw his difference not as a challenge, but as a gift. And slowly, like clouds parting after a storm, something in Ethan shifted. He began to speak, just a word here, a sentence there, always deliberately, always looking the person in the eye. It wasn't much, but it was real. At school, he made his first friend, a boy who shared his love for machines and never asked why Ethan was quiet. At the academy, Captain Reyes became a mentor of sorts, guiding him through simulator modules not to teach him, but to see how far he would go on his own. One evening, after class, Claire stood by the academy fence, watching as the twilight reflected in the hangar windows. Ethan walked up beside her, his sketchpad tucked under one arm, and said, with simple conviction, "I want to fly again." And in that moment, Claire knew, with all certainty, that he would. Months passed, and the story of Ethan Miller slowly retreated from the headlines, giving way to new crises, new miracles, new distractions. But in Seattle, in the quiet classrooms of the Aviation Academy, his presence remained, not as a legendy but as a boy, steady, silent, methodical. Ethan's days became rituals of learning, his mind absorbing theory and practice with an intensity that surprised even the most seasoned instructors. He didn't speak often, but he no longer needed to. His competence had a voice of its own, and when he did speak, it was only when the words mattered. On a cloudy afternoon in early spring, Claire received another envelope, this one marked with the Academy's emblem and sealed by hand. Inside was a formal invitation. A symbolic flight was being organized by the Academy to honor Ethan's achievement, and they wanted him to take the co-pilot seat beside a senior captain. It would be a short route, a controlled loop over the city and back, more demonstration than transportation. The aircraft would be empty except for instructors and officials. Still, it would be his first time in the air since Flight 1840, his first real flight as something more than a passenger, but not quite yet a pilot. Claire watched him as he read the letter. He didn't look up right away. He traced the corners of the page with his fingers, thoughtful. Then he looked at her and gave the smallest of nods. No dramatics, no questions, just a decision. That was how Ethan always moved, like the sky itself, deliberate and untouchable. The morning of the flight, the hangar buzzed with quiet energy. A modest group of observers had gathered, mostly staff and close family. No media were invited. The Academy had learned that Ethan didn't need spectacle. He needed space. Claire stood on the tarmac, bundled against the morning chill, her heart pacing to a rhythm older than memory. She remembered holding him as an infant, wondering if he'd ever speak, ever connect, ever reach beyond his silence. And now, she was about to watch him climb into a cockpit with purpose. Captain Reyes met Ethan at the bottom of the stairway. She didn't offer encouragement. She knew he didn't need it. Instead, she placed a hand lightly on his back and guided him up into the aircraft. Inside, the controls glowed softly, alive with potential. Ethan slid into the co-pilot's seat as if returning to a place that had been waiting for him. He adjusted the straps, calibrated the seat position, and ran through the pre-flight checklist alongside the captain. Every movement was smooth, memorized, absorbed through instinct and repetition. The engines roared to life. Claire stood still as the aircraft taxied forward, her hands clutching the railing in front of her. She wasn't afraid. Not this time. She had witnessed what her son could do when the world was falling apart. Now she would witness what he could do when it was whole. The aircraft lifted from the runway with elegant ease, banking gently into a clean arc over the city. The sun broke briefly through the clouds, casting the wings in golden light. Inside the cockpit, Ethan remained focused, responding to the captain's instructions with nods, hand signals, and, on rare occasion, a spoken word. When the time came, the captain handed control over to him fully. Ethan placed his hands on the yoke, adjusted the trim, and corrected the course by 2 degrees, so subtle it wouldn't register to a passenger. But to a pilot, it was the mark of intuition. During descent, as the runway stretched ahead, like a memory, the captain turned to Ethan and asked, almost playfully, "Anything you want to say before we land?" Ethan didn't respond right away, but as the aircraft touched down with a soft, seamless kiss against the tarmac, he turned his head, looked out at the distant crowd, and spoke the longest sentence he had ever said outside the safety of his home. His voice was clear, calm, and sure. "Now I can say it. I'm my father's son." On the ground, Claire's breath caught. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she even realized they were coming. The crowd erupted into applause, but Ethan didn't hear it. His focus remained in the cockpit, his world still in motion. The captain smiled and answered with quiet pride. And now the world knows it too. From that day forward, Ethan became a symbol, not of overcoming disability or surviving disaster, but of something simpler and far more powerful: clarity. A child who didn't seek to be heard but to understand, who waited for the right moment to speak, and when he did, the world listened. In the final image of that chapter, Claire and Ethan sit side by side near the edge of the runway, watching the sun dip behind the hangars. His sketchpad rests on his knees. On the final page, a drawing of the cockpit, detailed, precise, still in progress, and below it, in his small, careful handwriting, a single sentence: "Courage doesn't need a sound."